right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us for the premiere of The Quad, a new vodcast from Carnegie Dartlet. We're very excited about the group we have assembled today to talk over several topics impacting higher education, enrollment, and marketing. The Quad is a new vodcast. Each month we're going to host four industry leaders talking about four relevant topics from around the industry. All guests on the Quad complete Carnegie Dartlet's revolutionary team dynamics and personality assessment called Team Chem. So with me today for episode 1, we have Kent Barnes, who is the competitive and influential coach. Kent is the executive vice president for external affairs at Augustana College in Illinois. Also, Heather Daniels, the innovative and supportive optimist, is the director of admissions at Colorado State University. Hello, Heather. Daryl Jones is the supportive and abstract nonconformist. That's an interesting one that we're going to want to hear more about. Daryl is senior associate director of admissions at Gettysburg College. And last, but certainly not least, well, maybe among this group, is Todd Reinhardt, who is the sophisticated and caring guide. Todd is the vice chancellor for enrollment at the University of Denver. Todd, before we get started, I have to know a little bit about that persona, especially the sophisticated part, because I think we all know you, and we might question that.
It's questionable for sure. In fact, Daryl and I both agree we're protesting the entire instrument.
Okay.
Because we don't like to be put down into any box.
Okay.
And by the way, Eric, I just want you to know, if you look quickly and look away with the headset, you look a little bit like Jim Carrey.
You know, I get the Jim Carrey thing a lot. In fact, we did a feature on our company call a couple weeks ago that was like doppelgangers, where people submitted, and I guess that was an overwhelming submission for me was Jim Carrey. So I don't know how to take that, a compliment or an insult, but I guess I'll just take it. But yeah, thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited to have you together to talk during what I think is a very, very interesting time in higher education. And I know you all bring unique perspective to the conversation. We've got some history, I know, between the panelists. And Daryl, I would love to quiz you on a young Kent Barnes real quickly before we get started, because you, I believe, were his track coach in college at Gettysburg College. Can you share with us just your first memory of a young Kent Barnes? And I want to know if he wore the bow tie on the track.
So my very first memory actually was meeting him on the front steps of the admissions office at Gettysburg College. So his uncle, Del Gustafson, who certainly was a legend in our profession, introduced us. So Del was my boss. And I just knew, based on Kent's wit and his grin after he said some things, that we were going to get along pretty well. And what was cool is that that day we didn't really talk about track and field. We just talked about college and what things he wanted out of the experience. And as it turned out, Kent, not only a talented track and field athlete, so jumper and sprinter combination, but also quite a good singer back in those days as well. So performed with our top vocal ensemble at the time. No bow ties in his younger years. I saw him more in t-shirts and sweats than anything else.
Okay.
Good. What Daryl didn't add is that by singing both in the choir and running track, at least a couple days a week, I could take off from both, because I could tell somebody that I was at the other event. So I did that maybe a couple of times during that time. But
that's kind of like when I worked for you at Augustana, when you had 2 offices. I feel like that same sort of thing happened then.
Maybe there's a bit of a pattern there.
Yeah.
I also noticed, Daryl mentioned a lot of things about you except your track prowess. I didn't hear anything about your ability to run there, Kent.
You know, Todd, Daryl was an excellent coach because he figured out how to make the third leg of the 4x1 relay about 80 meters because that's the leg that I ran, and there was no question about it. I was the slowest guy on that relay team, and we worked those exchanges to make up for all of my slowness and we did pretty well. With that team actually, Daryl, as you recall, had an Olympian run the first leg of that the 4x1 relay. Arif Hussain, who went on and represented the country of Pakistan in the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona.
Oh,
Wow.
Yes,
all right.
and
Well, we're gonna. Oh, sorry, Daryl. Go
I
ahead.
did say that Kent was quite talented, and I don't know if you keep your gold medals around, but he has one from that. So again, jumper sprinter combo like his coach. And the reason why we gave him a short leg is that we long and triple jumpers just don't really want to run that far.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and jump into the four topics today, the four that we're going to hit on. The continued impact of COVID-19 on student recruitment and admissions, higher education's role in racial equity and social progress. Certainly a lot to unpack there. The pursuit of a career in admissions rather than kind of a stopping off point before the next job. And then work and life in quarantine and how that's impacting us all. I'll also ask each guest at some point to share a piece of advice for young up and comers in the industry and to share maybe an anecdote about somebody who's made an impact on their career journey as well. One housekeeping item before we get started, there is a Q&A feature in the bottom of your Zoom menu. Feel free to drop in a question or a comment there or to give Kent a hard time about being the only one in the call with a tie. We're happy to hear it, and we'll try to address that as we go. Okay, so topic one, the continued impact of COVID-19. Certainly we've talked a lot about this throughout the spring. I was just talking with Daryl in the pregame here about the last date that we were really, either on campus or traveling to campuses. I think the first place that everybody went to was yield of the senior class, the class of 2020. Can you all talk about, sort of how you've had to evolve this spring to connect with those students and serve them through enrollment, which we're not even there yet. But what have you had to do? Where have you had successes in reaching and connecting with that group? Ken, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll be happy to. I think that one of the observations I would make about the spring and yield season, and I'm interested in what Daryl and Heather and Todd think on this also. There have been a number of things that we've enacted, and we're thinking, my gosh, why weren't we doing this previously? The online or the virtual information session and through Slate webinar, doing one-on-one conversations with students. It's been great for us from a geographic diversity perspective, and I find myself thinking, wow, this is something that we're only going to think about trying to improve. So I think that's been one of the real positive things. I think the more challenging thing through the spring and into the summer is this whole what I would describe as families and parents want certainty where no certainty exists, and we're not in the. I mean that's not the way we typically operate. Usually we're problem solvers and we provide answers. And right now, I just feel, and this isn't necessarily just at the foot of enrollment management, it's institutional, but people say they want more communication, but it's not that they want more communication, they want certainty where it doesn't exist. And so those are two quick observations, but I'm really curious what other people have found this spring. Todd, how about we go to you first?
It's interesting you mentioned yield. We tracked the yield on our virtual events, and it was about 40%. Now, granted, somebody who's going to register and do one of your, your virtual webinars is probably a little more inclined for your school to begin with. But what I was pleased about, I at least realized we weren't messing it up. We weren't turning people away. And, I think what we found in some ways, it's more personal. I know we're all tired of doing these Zoom events, but when you think about it, your admitted student days, you might have 500 or 600 people in an auditorium, and no one's really going to raise their hand and ask the faculty member a question. And that's just a difficult, environment to really have good discussions. And the webinars were a great platform. A lot of times we'd have a dean, maybe one or two professors, and then 2 or 3 of their current students. And especially with the chat and the Q&A, even if you don't want to ask it live, you could just type it in, and the dean or the professor might be talking, but in the background, maybe one of those student panelists is answering the questions in the chat. So in some ways, we were able to really engage a lot more students with the virtual programs. And I agree with you. These are things that, why weren't we doing these before? Especially the one-on-one appointments and some of the tours. When you think of how far away a lot of our prospective students live from our campuses, to be able to, not just have a virtual tour that sits on your website that they can kind of scroll around on their own, but actually having your current tour guides do some really innovative things. It's worked out great. And I think what my staff's worried about is when we eventually get to this other place where we can do in person again, I want to just keep doing both. And they keep saying, well, we're going to need a staff for virtual and a staff for in person. So when are you giving us more people?
How have you continued to engage that audience, whether it be students or parents? I mean, typically you'd have orientations going on right now and have students and parents on campus. How have you continued to engage with them in the virtual format?
I can jump in. I wanted to comment on something that Kent had said in terms of just the reach also. So we had one of our admitted events in March that we had to cancel. And when we rescheduled it in a virtual format, over 70% of the attendees had not planned to be on campus for the on-campus event. So that was similar to what Todd and Kent have both said, just in terms of the reach and the opportunity. And I think the engagement, for us, we expanded our hours. So before, we would never really offer a lot into the evening. And so really to be able to be available up until 8 o'clock in the evening, to be able to talk with parents. And similar, I feel like even though we don't have a lot of answers, just validating that people want to be heard, that's been the most important thing. So it's been really challenging. I think so much of us are, I know I'm concerned about what these next couple of months will look like when we do reopen and when we're back on campus. And just being able to answer a phone call, respond to an email, or help a family feel validated has done wonders for us.
What about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, before I chime in, it appears we may have been Zoom bombed if you look at the chat.
Yeah,
So,
we're trying to get into the Q&A and delete those out.
Yeah, sounds
as we're
good.
going.
So part of what was interesting about what you heard from my buddies here is, in the past it might be, okay, we're going to fly to some place, maybe New York City, give a speech here, do a yield event that's attached to a junior event, and then you wait a day, fly out to the next thing the next morning. Well, now it was, you could do a yield event for students in New York City 1 hour, and the next hour you're doing one in Chicago, and then the next hour after that, a colleague is doing one in the evening in California. So I'm with you, Kent. It's this whole idea that, yes, we wish we all could get students onto our campuses, but my gosh, it has been interesting to be able to switch gears, move to another audience in another part of the country, and not have the fatigue of flying, not have the fatigue of drying, not have the fatigue of going to bed late, trying to answer emails after you speak before you fly to the next thing. So, I mean, it was an exciting opportunity, but I think if we're all honest, we were all being reactive for the most part from when we dropped our letters, because nobody saw this coming. I mean, I can think of March 13th when we released our decisions and being told, hey, you can't fly to your other home in suburban Chicago. And I said, okay, well, I won't go, but I'm going. And then the next day it was, do not travel. And I was thinking, wait a minute, what do you mean? And then Monday, the following Monday, we had the meeting, which was do not travel and get what you need today because you're not coming back for a while. And meanwhile, we were all thinking 2 weeks, we're back at it. But if you think about how we've all had to upgrade our phone system so that we can be accessible to families, we've all had to spread out our days so that we are available in the morning for one time zone and late at night for another. we've had to manage staff energy. I mean, all of those things became a part of what we're doing now. And, you know, thankfully our institutions did it successfully enough that we're still here to talk about it.
I think in the initial frenzy of focusing on the class of 2020, which was obviously important at that time to connect with those students to serve them through the end of their process this fall, the worlds of high school juniors were disrupted completely with standardized testing disruption, their school going remote, not, you know, looking at the uncertainty in the year and a half ahead for them for their entire college search. And I've heard a lot in my conversations with leaders like you around the country that the shifting has really happened to look at the class of 2021 and how we're reaching out to them and connecting with them. Can you guys talk about your recruitment efforts on that front? How are you connecting with that audience? What is this time, do you think, going to mean for kind of the future of student search as a whole? Heather, I'll jump to you first on this one.
Okay, yeah. I appreciate you saying that, Eric. And I feel like there was such a frenzy for fall 20. And then many of us were like, wait, let's not think about those, do not forget about those juniors. And I often think also about rising second year students in college as well. I just think of the populations and sort of this college going age that have been so deeply impacted by this. And yeah, so all of our spring visits, all of our travel, all of our events on campus, all of our summer, we're still not open at Colorado State up in Fort Collins. We don't have visitors yet. We have no timeline for when we'll be able to bring visitors to campus. And so really thinking, having to think about it in a different way. And actually we all were in a group together a while ago, and Kent, you had said something that I keep repeating. I need to give you some more credit for it. But
Don't do that. Don't do that.
But you talked about going old school admissions. I just love that. And I keep referring back to that. And I think back of when I first started in admissions as an admissions counselor and was doing things way before we had so much of the technology that we have now, and how to personalize the experience, validate the students, validate them through this process, and try to find ways for them to connect. We've really expanded our reach across campus and relied so much on our campus partners in the colleges and different offices across campus, and know that it just cannot be only the Office of Admissions that is recruiting the classes to come.
I never thought that I'd see a telephone script encouraging rising seniors to attend a virtual information session or a session with faculty, and you know, that's sort of the old school thing that you're doing. I think the longer we wait for you know, before times to return, which they're never going to return, the more dangerous it becomes with the fall of 2021. I mean, I guess our approach, first of all, I continue to have some concerns about the availability of names because of the suspension of so much standardized testing. And we're a place, and I'm sure that many of the folks who are listening that are pretty reliant upon student search and the availability of names. So one of the first things that we had to do this spring was look pretty seriously at some non-traditional name providers, you know, whether it's expanding partnership with places like CapEx or Niche, I guess they call themselves, and looking at all sorts of available resources. And we sort of got on that pretty early as we started to think about fall 2021. And then we're combining that with, as Heather said, some of these old school tactics. I mentioned earlier that I'm sitting in my office, and we have reintroduced campus tours. They get to walk around the outside of buildings and see our beautiful campus with their masks after they've gone through a temperature check and answered some health questions. You know, I'm excited to have people on campus, but it's not the full experience. So we've got to figure out ways to supplement that. And it's a little bit like when I started in admissions in the early 1990s, when you sort of had this multiple visit philosophy, when kids and families actually visited colleges multiple times, right? You get them there for an open house, and the whole message of the open house was come back for an interview. And once you got them for an interview, come back for a classroom visit and an overnight stay. And then once you do that, and come back for our really fancy late yield program. And I think now we've got to think with the 2021s, what are those experiences that can deepen the engagement overall in the absence of the campus visit? So, I mean, those are things that I'm sure my colleagues are thinking of as well.
And I think this has really generated a lot of additional conversation around the country with the whole test optional movement. I know many of your institutions have gone that way for at least the next couple of cycles. Many institutions have followed suit around the country. What do you think it's going to do for that in terms of acceleration? Obviously, this whole time has accelerated a number of things in higher education. That's just one of them. But curious to know your thoughts, Todd. I'll jump to you on that.
Yeah, say that again, accelerating what?
The test optional movement around the country. I think it's like created a lot of momentum for that.
You bet. And I guess we were perfectly timed. We were test optional. We just finished our first year. So this will be our second year of test optional. I think it's great. I mean, obviously you would have liked people to have arrived at this philosophical conclusion maybe a few years ago and not needed a crisis to kind of make this, but let's take advantage of that opportunity. And I don't think anyone's saying that tests aren't valid or they don't bring anything to the table. What they're saying is they really should be one piece, one factor. And why have we put so much emphasis on it, both for admission and for merit scholarships? And I'm hoping people just kind of, take a step back and realize that it had become far too important in the admission process. So I'm really encouraged to see all the movement.
All right. Well, we're going to move on to topic 2. Keep ourselves on schedule. Obviously, I think this is a very important one to talk about. A lot of folks around higher education that I'm talking with are exploring ways that they can create more equity and access within their institutions. And we're all well aware of the protests and the movement happening around the country on the heels of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So one thing that hit me early on in the week after that was that in many moments in American history like this, college campuses have been home to protests, to movements, to kind of gathering the voice of young people as we drive for change in this country. And that was absent this spring when this happened, that there wasn't this density of people on a college campus to come together around a cause. What do you think? I would just be curious to know your thoughts of what you think maybe we missed out on in this piece, or how it was different because that presence wasn't there.
I'll start with that one. The hard part is that all of us are accustomed to working in large communities. So no matter what the size of our colleges and universities, we're accustomed to operating in those communities and getting some of the energy for our statements that we put out, our public proclamations. I mean, they come from students. If you think about March for Our Lives, if you think about some of the other more recent political movements, and I just call them human decency movements that our young people have given us, we were all lacking that. But I think what colleges and universities did that was right was that they put out statements from their upper administration, maybe trustees, maybe presidents, but it was still harder because it was done in that vacuum that you mentioned, which is, I look forward to those moments when our students band together and they say, we need to have a town hall about this, or we need to have a time when we can stop what is happening in the classes, the discourse in classes, and actually make it about these moments. So I know that a number of our professors did it virtually, but it is still, as we all know, different when you don't have the pre-class discourse that happens casually, the in the residence hall, in the dining hall conversation, and the post-class conversation that happens naturally just because so many people are together at the time. So it was a missing element, but just as we had to do with Yale, just as we are doing with junior recruitment and sophomore recruitment, our students found a way to make it happen virtually. So, activities didn't stop, they just changed the ways in which they happened.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope that we haven't missed the opportunity or the occasion for deep conversation. I mean, I hope that we're preparing for the fall and when we welcome students back, to have those deep conversations, which Daryl has mentioned. I think that this movement is so important that we need to capitalize on it. You know, one thing that I had suggested on campus, and you all might be familiar with the Pulitzer Prize winning podcast 1619, which is just fantastic. We have a common reading at Augustana, like many colleges do, and I suggested, it was, I think, probably too late, but I said, you know, maybe we ought to be Augustana Listens rather than Augustana Reads. And we ought to ask all of our students to listen to the podcast 1619 so that we can be proactive in having these important conversations. One of my worries is that we take a formulaic approach to this. And there was a meme that said higher ed's top favorite ways to stall and diffuse student activist efforts demands. 1, listening sessions. 2, instituting a special task force. 3, hiring chief diversity officers. And 4, climate surveys. And man, I hope we move well beyond that to action. We need, I think we need this moment, and I'm actually excited about the fall and hopefully the energy that students will bring back. But if you steal that idea to replace your first year reading with whatever institution listens, will you at least please credit me, since I can't get it to happen here?
This whole thing is about stealing ideas, Kent.
Well, what is this, a case conference? Everything.
I think that I think a lot about higher education's role in this, and I think that in its purest form, higher education is about access. It's about offering an avenue to people to improve their lives and to improve the lives of their families and their future generations. And I don't think higher education has lived up to that ideal. And I'd be curious to know this group's thoughts on what needs to change, particularly in the admissions process, maybe the way we recruit students, to help reach that ideal or improve things on that front. I'll kick it to Todd first, I guess.
Yeah, sure. And, you know, I think, and obviously admission is what we control, you know, directly, but we also, as leaders on our campuses, can influence what happens once they're there as well, right? It's really two things. I mean, one, our campuses don't reflect oftentimes, higher ed oftentimes doesn't reflect the local community as far as the identities that are represented in those cities and states. So we have to do a better job there. And, you know, I think one of the things we can really push our institutions is on the fundraising side. You know, I can show you our applicant pools from the last few years. It's been growing steadily for students of color, for Black students, Latinx students, and their application rates, their admit rates. But a lot of times the enrollment rate has remained relatively flat. And I think, you know, when you really look, what would be the difference? And certainly we all have to address, students don't just turn down schools because of financial aid. We have to address the culture and climate on our campuses as well. And that's where we can play that role as a leader. But we need far more financial aid, you know, with low income, moderate income families. Especially, you know, private schools, that we're asking them to commit to something that's very valuable for sure. But even when they have the willingness, you know, ability is a different thing. We've got to commit more of our dollars at all of our institutions to make sure students, not just academically are admitted, but they can get to the access part of actually enrolling.
Heather, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to kind of go back to something that Kent was saying about sort of the typical reaction and how that happens on college campuses, and thinking about what we did lose this spring was the opportunity for people to come together, and the uniqueness of us all being on an educational, within education, and it's this interesting connection between the two. And I am excited about that part of it, and thinking that there's such an opportunity for people to come together. And it's been difficult. I know we're going to get into this probably in a little bit, just in terms of our staff and connecting during this time. But that's something over the last couple of weeks that we've been thinking about, but we have to do it over video. And I can't wait until we can actually be in a room together, but to really examine our admissions processes, the way we, as you said, recruit students, but even as we bring students through the process, what barriers do we have in place, and how do we educate ourselves as a staff? Are we we have the best staff that can address the needs that are out there for our students and really truly be reflective of our community and be an access-minded institution. So I think we're on this cusp of really great things ahead of us, and just getting back together will help that in so many ways.
Well, I think obviously the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic too exacerbates a lot of those things. We've seen in our surveys of prospective students this spring that where we ask about confidence and ability to pay for higher education, that those numbers are amplified much more greatly in minority populations and students of lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So that becomes a whole nother access issue that's been elevated or exacerbated by the current circumstance, which I think is going to take a lot of really intense examination of financial aid practices. Todd, like you say, the financial aid offerings that you offer to help rectify or help meet the students at their level of need. Anything else on topic 2 before we jump ahead to topic 3?
One more thing to add
Okay.
to that, and it's just what institutions need to do. We need to move way beyond access and make it about inclusion, because that helps enrollment targets. You know, I talk about this often, and I'm not the one who originated the phrase, but I use it more often. It's admission offices are such customer-focused offices. The warm handoff that happens into the remainder of the institution, you know, as has already been spoken, I mean, this year has underscored the need for everyone to be part of the recruitment and retention. So as an example, you know, let's not make it about a student of color. Let's just make it about a rural kid somewhere USA. Well, if there is no broadband and we are giving our information sessions, virtual interviews, chats with students via some high-speed network when it's not available, are we even being accessible, let alone being inclusive? If we are talking about rising students at our own institutions, you know, a bunch of us have had the luxury, thank goodness, of sending hotspots to people who needed them or laptops to people who have needed them, but that's another expense. So when you're talking about inclusion and success as part of access, I mean, that is something that colleges and universities have been forced to look at, but it's almost embarrassing that as an industry, we didn't do a better job of that before.
Daryl, can I add in? I want to add to that.
Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that, because one of the things we've been talking about in our office is that this class that's coming in this fall, one of my coworkers said this class is so fragile. And I was like, oh, it's a good word. And so I've been hesitant really throughout the summer, passing them off to housing, passing them off to orientation. I'm like, be careful, be good, be kind, be responsive, because there's just so much unknown. And I think that transition, and I mentioned earlier, we were talking about our returning student registration and where students are at, and our juniors, seniors, fifth year students, they're fine. It's those rising second year students who had that first year taken away from them. And I'm like, what are we doing for those students? Because they're at such a crucial point of their college education. So thanks for mentioning that piece of the retention and inclusion.
You know, my Carnegie Dartlet leadership profile might suggest that I have some ownership issues, maybe. And I'm like you, Heather. I mean, the admissions team took over the virtual orientation sessions so that we could continue to operate with sort of the elegance, and that I think Daryl described it as warm handoff. Because they are fragile, or they've had a different experience, and we felt really strongly that we weren't going to just hand them off. And I mean, who knows? We might be sending note cards out if we wouldn't have encouraged a better collaboration and partnership. So I think that both those comments are very relevant.
Okay, thank you. Topic 3, this one I think is interesting, and having worked in admissions on 2 college campuses, I think it's always interesting to talk about kind of the career journey that people take, and how young admissions counselors enter the profession and how they view it, and what they're looking forward to. So I think a lot of the time, many young counselors get hired right out of school. They think it's a stepping stone job to what they're going to go do for a real job. And I know many across the industry want to see that change, that we can develop a career path for people to progress. Daryl actually suggested this as a topic for the podcast, so I'm going to kick it to you first, Daryl. How do you think we can change that as an industry to lay a path for young graduates to see a future for themselves in this profession?
So thank you for that, Eric. It's all about how we choose to train. I mean, if you choose to treat these newer professionals as just roadrunners, or just, well, they'll only be here for a year or two, so let's pay them as if they'll only be here for a year or two, and let's not train them. Well, then it's your own fault. So if we make it so that we train them to be top level professionals, so that you actually take a new person and put them in some of your most crucial target markets, well, now you're doing something right. So, you know, it's even from small things like, I refuse, not that anybody on our staff would do it, but I refuse to have anyone call themselves a rookie, and I refuse to call anybody a rookie, and I don't want anybody ever to utter that in my presence or outside of my presence. Second, you have to pay people what they're worth. Their buddies who are doing other things in business, or who might go into development or other things, are paid more. So let's pay them as if we mean to retain them, because if not, you're just throwing a salary away. But part of it is also, we all have to take this mentoring piece seriously. I mean, just as I was mentored well in my younger years by people within my office and people in other offices and professional associations, we just have to take it seriously enough to treat these people as professionals first, and not rookies, road runners, and people that are expendable.
At the same time, how do you, oh, I'm sorry, Todd, were you going to go?
No, I'm just nodding and agreeing with
Oh,
Daryl.
okay.
I just want to know though, because truthfully, we talked decades about the lower salaries in our profession. At some point, we've got to actually change that. We can't just, 20 years from now, still be saying, boy, we better pay these admission counselors more than what we do now. So I don't know what the answer is, because when you go to your HR departments and they run the, all the analysis on pay scales at different schools, they say, well, you're competitive and in the range with what everyone else is paying. So it's really hard to get over that hump and, suddenly pay someone 50 or 60,000 instead of 30 or 40, when you pull up the 100 other schools and they're paying 30 and 40. So,
Yeah, that's such a great point. We a couple years ago, within 2 years, I think we lost close to 10 admissions counselors to other positions on campus. So it was like, oh my gosh, we are training the best advisors and access coordinators possible on our campus. But I think you're so right when it comes to the field in general, and you look at peer institutions and what's being paid for entry-level employees.
I don't want to be critical of higher ed as an enterprise, but I think part of this is, whether it's an administrative department or staff area, unfortunately, we're sort of modeled after the professorate. And that sort of tiering of assistant, associate, full. And as a result, I don't know that we're able to make the investments. At Augustana, I supervise the enrollment management function, but also the advancement function. And I'm constantly mystified at the fact that oftentimes the annual giving staff is just like the admissions counseling staff. It's entry level, it's low pay. And then I look at the balance sheet and I look at where the money comes from. And to put the least experienced, least paid people in the position that actually drives revenue. And I would hope that maybe as we in higher ed become a little bit more, as Bob Zemsky would say, no market, no mission. As we think about our market and we think about what drives revenue, we might see some common sense enter in. You can't have somebody running your annual fund who's got years of experience when you got to be more creative than ever before to have the fourth largest line of revenue help deliver to the bottom line. And the same goes with admission staff and admissions counseling. I think the other thing that we could do as leaders, though, is we got to stop with that old rhetoric of 3 or 30. right? I mean, we sort of set it up in sort of being jocular about our profession. Well, you know, people, they're in it for 3 years and they leave, or otherwise they're like us and they've stayed too long. Or at least I'll speak for myself. So I think we bear some responsibility there. But I think it is this context within higher ed with this tiering, which puts it at a bit of a disadvantage to combat the pay issue.
How do you create a progression? And I think that we've done that within the offices with the assistant director, senior assistant director, associate director kind of elevation flow. Because you don't want people to be an admissions counselor for 30 years, right? You want to give them progression and build skill sets and give them other opportunities, but at the same time, you need to conquer that core job function of an admissions counselor to recruit students. So how do you build that in for a young counselor?
I'd say one thing, and I'll defer to my colleagues on this, but I think one of the things that each time somebody takes a step, it can't be because it's been a reward for a job well done. It's an invitation to do better and to do more. And I think about all of the times that I've had the privilege of being able to promote somebody. That's been the conversation. This isn't, hey, great job. This is, I've got a challenge ahead for you, and I think you're the right person to do that. And I think you're validating them. You're validating what they have to offer, and I think you have a different opportunity, a different conversation, and they're more likely to expand their role or see their role expanded. That hardcore counseling and recruiting doesn't fall by the wayside because you've been invited to do something new. So that's at least an idea there to think of those conversations a little bit differently.
I would agree with that. And I think there's really great opportunities to give new, younger staff the opportunity to kind of look under the hood a little bit and just get a better understanding of some of the other conversations that they may not be necessarily involved in, but certainly contribute to the work. And I think that's where you can get some of that excitement and energy and innovation and new ideas. And I don't know how you all feel, but I feel like so much of a result of what we had to do this spring and some of the initiatives we put into place came from our staff members like, well, what about this? And it might have been like, well, that we could never do that. But no, actually, that's exactly what we're going to do. So I think there's just a lot of opportunity to provide more seats at the table.
I think that's a really good segue, Heather, into topic 4, which is just kind of this existence within quarantine or our remote setting. Carnegie Dartlet's office, we've been remote since late March. I know most of the campuses I've talked with, Heather, your campus was the last campus I was on. March 11th, I came home from there and I haven't left home since. How have you continue to try to lead your teams? I think leadership is particularly important in a time like this where people are uneasy. They're out of their routine. How have you kept them engaged? How have you kept them focused? Talk a little bit about that. Daryl, I'll kick to you first.
So one of the things I have to do is give a shout out to my Dean Gail Sweezy and VP Barbara Fritz, because you can have enough weekly virtual meetings and whatever else, but it's the check-in that our whole staff was doing with each other. There is a formal check-in status that is regular that Gail Sweezy has, but people have been doing it with each other, not about work, not about a project, not through Slack, not through whatever else, but sometimes can't talk about old school. It has been, I'm picking up the phone and I'm either FaceTiming you or we're just talking and we're venting and we're just seeing how you're doing. So it's been some of that. It's been the virtual happy hour at the end of the week. It's been we also have a dean that shares a whole lot of information, and this is tied to training. She believes in giving people all the inside information that she has so that people feel like they're part of the inside. But, my job in supporting Gail and Barbara is just keep my ear open and care about people, because, we're all worker bees. We're all people who love the idea of being hard workers, but you can overdo it. So even talking to people, younger people who have said, well, at the time that I need to take a walk in the middle of the day, I just send an email to everybody saying I'll be offline for the next hour and I'll come back. Well, me, Mr. Old School, never thought about doing that, but it's easy to do. Or if it's, I need to stand up, walk around the house, drink water, do something to take good care of myself instead of sitting and having bad posture for 8 or 9 or 10 hours. We've just been encouraging people to do what they can to take care of themselves psychologically and personally in whatever space in which they work. And I think it has kept our creative energy really high. I think it has kept our innovation energy really high. So, it's one thing to sort of have these weekly meetings, but it's another thing to know your staff well enough that you can see if someone is not quite engaged, even if they're in just a little box, and you just check in with them to make sure they're okay. So, I just model the behavior that my colleagues do, and it seems to work. But I'm interested to hear what my friends have to say about that.
I agree, Daryl. I've been on the phone more the last 3 months than I probably was the previous 5 years. Because, normally you would just, maybe right after lunch or right at the end of the day, you're gonna walk down the hallway and just check in on people, or you get some brilliant idea, you want to run it by 2 or 3 of them, and just, you don't have that opportunity anymore. And we've kept all of our standing meetings, but those are also official now, right? You cover your 4 agenda items, and then you get off, and then you get on another call for an hour. But I've tried to pick up the phone more individually, especially, I think our staff is just exhausted. Right? I'm sure everyone feels that way. These last 4 months, mornings, nights, weekends, some of it is because when you're working remotely, you just never really turn off. And I think our team's done a good job of being conscientious about that and intentionally turning off and going on some walks. But, I'm just worried about overall morale, right? When you have to turn your business model completely upside down and learn all these new things and execute it in a really short window of time. It's been amazing. I'm just so proud of our team, but I've wanted to check in with them because I know how hard they've been working, and because you also can't go anywhere, right? Even when you're home, no restaurants were open, no, movie theaters, there was no release. Even when you're at home. So I just worried about the staff, and I continue to worry about them.
What about turnover? Todd, I know you are going through a search right now to replace the irreplaceable Lana Forte
That's right.
for your executive director of admissions. How are you handling that in this virtual environment?
Well, we've been fortunate in admission and financial aid. We just have a couple of openings in both departments, and our university's been really committed. They're giving us permission to fill these positions, but it's really awkward doing a full search on Zoom. And not that, it's fine. I mean, everyone can connect with the different areas of our division and I think get a sense there. And so you can ask all the questions. What I miss with more of a traditional search is picking the candidate up in the morning and taking them out for breakfast. It's just, one-on-one, like me and that candidate for half hour having breakfast or 20 minutes in the car. And then going out maybe just with 4 or 5 people that night for dinner. And you get far more done, I think, sometimes at that dinner, learning about a person and just how their alignment with your values than you do kind of asking them those 10 formal questions. So it's working, and we're really excited about the process, but I miss some of that X factor that you get just, when they're on campus.
Definitely. Anybody else going through searches for admissions counselors or any other positions throughout this time, or pretty steady staffing?
We're doing a replacement of a 1-year person who we've been granted the permission to keep on, and then we added a person. And there was a question in the chat about how we've approached our administration about trying to promote and do all those things, financially and career-wise with dwindling budgets. I will just say that we've been lucky, because if any year underscored the need to have adequate staffing, man, was it ever this one. Because if you think about all of the daytime things we were doing, plus the nighttime panels and chats and whatever else we were doing, I mean, the exhaustion that you mentioned, Todd, as we all know, is how many hours a day? can you look at a screen? But you have to, because you don't know what the competition is doing, which you knew was quite a bit. So it's almost that now that we can strategize and say, here is what we need to get done, because we can't fly people in right now. We don't know what it will be like to be without college fairs, college nights, in-person case studies, to be without search, all those things we've mentioned. So, again, thank goodness our top folks who control the budget institutionally saw the need to have that driver be, well, if you don't enroll a class, you are without a whole lot of other things. So I guess we were just lucky, but I don't know. Heather and Todd, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we're about to launch 2 searches for admissions counselor type roles, and fortunately feel great support from our administration that those are critical positions. So it's interesting, Ken, I'm thinking about what you were saying in terms of the paid employees. They're critical, but yeah, now we just need to bump up those salaries a little bit. But fortunately, we've got really great support from our administration on the open positions that we do have. But in our office, we actually have not had any open positions for almost a year and a half. And so we went through this really great long period of some stability, and now a little bit of a shakeup this summer. And so about to embark on what that looks like in a Zoom interview process. We do have 2 high-level leadership positions that just completed interview processes, provost position and a vice president for university communications. And to conduct those and be a part of those interviews in a Zoom setting, so interesting. But I agree, Todd, you totally miss out on just the one-off conversations and the opportunity to get to know someone outside of the formality of an interview.
Sorry, go ahead, Ken.
We'd use the suspension of the CEPP to begin to prepare our institution for more staffing during the summer with the anticipation. I mean, it seems quaint now, right? I mean, with COVID spring, but we thought, hey, it's going to be more important than ever before to have people in the office working during the summer with enrolling students. And we'd made the case to move 2 10-month employees to 12-month in order to prepare for that. And it allowed us, I think, it's allowing us to serve students even better. Eric, your original question, I want to acknowledge my direct reports who've been awesome at engaging staff. My director of regional recruitment in the Chicagoland area, 3 times a week, we have what is just called a hangout. And, anybody who can join, it's a time to do all that type of conversation, Todd, that you do with no agenda when you're walking down the hallway. And we started that week 1, and that's continued, and that's been great. The other thing I would say is I've really adapted. I mean, I was doing a weekly check-in with all my direct reports on every Friday, and those started to get really sort of rote, and they just weren't needed anymore. So we went back to sort of the way that we typically engage: lots of phone, lots of chat, lots of text message. But I think it's been really important not to sort of impose your need for information or feeling like you're engaged, to be more responsive and to listen. But my direct reports have been awesome through all of this.
I think this conversation is a good segue into what we're calling our 4 tips section. So we've got about 5 minutes left. We're going to go around the horn real quick. I'll start with you, Todd. If you're talking to somebody young and up and coming in the industry, what's a piece of advice that you would share as they kind of look to map a career path for themselves?
One, higher ed is just one of the greatest professional opportunities you could ever have. In fact, you mentioned candidates. Yesterday, I was just telling one of the candidates what I love about working in higher ed is lifetime learning. And I got my master's degree 20 years ago. I haven't been in a traditional classroom in a long, long time. It's amazing how much I learn there every single day in this job. Just being on a campus, listen to a podcast or read an article that one of our professors has done, or having them present to our staff. I mean, you are just surrounded every day by super smart, caring, inclusive, innovative. I told our staff, you're not going to find many environments where you get to work with people like this. And I know it's why I've stayed as long as I have.
Heather?
Yeah, I would say that network is so important. No, this is such a collaborative industry, and I think about the friends that I've made across the country, across the world, and the last 20 years being in admissions. And so my advice would be to stay connected, find others that do similar work at other institutions, make those connections, and keep the relationship going throughout your career. So many of my mentors, previous supervisors, have remained constant throughout my life as I moved into other roles and thought about different things.
Daryl?
Mine is just don't be afraid once you've gone in one or two or three or 35 years. Don't be afraid to learn from people who are younger than you, because their ideas, their freshness, their closeness to native technology, I mean, it saved us this spring because their willingness to try that thing that we said 15 years ago, we tried that, so I don't know. So don't be afraid to learn from people who are certainly your peers within your institution and outside, as Heather mentioned, but also those who, if you're in it for 2 or 3 or 4 or however many years, learn from people who have a little less experience but fresher ideas.
Kent?
Hey, if you like goal-driven work and a rush, this is it. I mean, every single year, I studied political science in college, and I've always approached every campaign, and I'll be starting my 29th on July 6th, which is job day for me. And you know, this is great work because every single year you have to repeat and even get better results. And it's a rush for me. I love the work.
All right, we're going to do one more quick round robin. I think one thing that's really interesting about this industry, Heather, you mentioned the network. It's such a close-knit community of people, and I found that out as I left campus and now travel around the country for my work, that everybody has stories of a second-degree connection, first-degree connection, third-degree connection who've influenced their career or helped them along the way. And for me, actually, Kent, you're one of those people. Hired me for my first higher education job 12 years ago. I think at every turn of my career where I've made a transition to something else, I've called you and talked it through with you and sought advice on that front. And I know we all have those people. I would love to, you know, in the next 3 minutes, just hear from each of you, you know, who one of those people is for you and how they helped you along the way. We'll go reverse order, starting with Kent.
Well, there are countless people, including the 3 people who I'm sharing this conversation with, who I admire and consider to be mentors. And then, of course, my Uncle Delwyn, who was a pioneer and incredible in this industry. But the person who I would actually acknowledge was my boss at Elizabethtown College, Gordon Bateman. Gordon was the Dean of Admissions and Enrollment Management and made a decision and convinced the president that Gordon wanted to phase towards retirement. And Gordon and I switched positions from me being director of admissions to dean of enrollment management at Elizabethtown, and he became director of admissions. And he continued to mentor me for 5 years. And what an incredibly selfless act from Gordon to help me get on my pathway. And I hope at some point when the time is right, I can do something similar. So he's a giant, at least in my career trajectory.
Daryl?
Yes, and likewise. So, you know, Kent used to have me come out and facilitate parts of his staff retreats. So in having been a mentor to him, he was able to mentor me as well, because I had to be on my game if he was having me come out to talk to them. But certainly other than Del Gustafson, who really took a chance on me, Rusty Shunk, who worked for Dickinson College. And in those days, you know, Del and several other deans used to say, look, you are going to be mentored by a person from another staff. Here's the phone number. They're expecting you to call. So Rusty is the one who gave me the idea of saying, you can be a senior associate, still lead in the profession, but still have the freedom to create. And so that's, I mean, he made it so that I could do what I do now. And I am forever indebted.
Heather?
All right. So mine similar is my first boss, Scott Flanagan. He was our director of admissions at Edgewood College, where I started my career. And I knew him when I was a tour guide. And then when I became an admissions counselor, quickly found that this was my career path. And he helped me along the way during my first couple of years, and then was actually the one to push me out in a good way for other opportunities. And he's been that constant as every opportunity has come along. And so I hope, kind of what you said, Ken, I hope to be that for someone else someday, because he's someone who really shifted and helped me think about life as a professional.
And Todd.
Yeah, I've been fortunate. I think, like everyone on this panel, I've learned from every single person I've ever worked for, not just my bosses, my colleagues, first-year counselors. I did have an amazing boss for a long time, Tom Willoughby, that everyone knows. Tom really taught me how to connect all the dots, like learn admission, but also learn enrollment management, learn about vendors and marketing, learn about ethics. And then don't keep all those in silos. Like, you've got to be thinking about all of those things, pretty much every decision you make. You can't just put on one of those hats. Have that lens across the board. And it really paid off. And by the way, he's someone I still check in with. When the world shut down in early March and our business model was thrown to the wind, trust me, he's one of the first people I called and started running ideas by. So I don't know if they ever can retire as being your mentor.
Absolutely. Last question for the group. Does everybody have Disney Plus downloaded so they can watch the Hamilton premiere on Friday?
Night?
Yes. I've created a movie theater in my garage for the event. My kids are pretty pumped.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I just want to thank you guys for joining me for episode 1 of the Quad. We're excited to have this be a monthly feature for the industry. I think it's going to generate great dialogue with leaders like yourselves. And I think we kicked it off here with a great group. So thank you again for joining me. I appreciate it. And for you in the audience, we'll see you next time on the Quad.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.